The bus pulled into Ridgecrest Correctional Facility at 60:14 in the morning. Rain, gray sky. The kind of silence that only exists in places where hope checks out at the front gate and never comes back for its belongings. 14 new inmates stepped off that bus. Heads down, eyes empty. Moving the way people move when they have already made their peace with what is waiting on the other side of the intake door. Most of them had been through the system before. They knew the rules without being told. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak first. Don't show fear. But never show strength either, not yet. Not until you understand exactly who controls what. But one man on that bus didn't follow any of those rules. He didn't look down. He didn't look nervous. He stepped off slowly, the way a man steps off a boat he has sailed 1,000 times. Not because the water isn't dangerous, but because he made his peace with dangerous water a very long time ago. Medium height, older, a little heavier than photographs suggested, salt and pepper ponytail, slightly damp from the rain, no expression on his face, just eyes still, dark, patient, the kind of eyes that have seen the worst this world offers, sat across from it, measured it, absorbed it, and quietly decided it wasn't that interesting. The correctional officers ran them through intake. Fingerprints, photos, jumpsuits. The new inmates were assigned to Block C general population. That was the first problem, because Block C at Ridgecrest wasn't just another cell block. Every inmate processed through that facility knew the name before they ever saw the corridor. Guards who worked that block came in every morning, with their shoulders already slightly tighter than they should have been. 3 gangs controlled everything inside those walls. The West Side Kings ran the yard and the work rotations. The Iron Brotherhood controlled the cafeteria and the supply lines, and a group known simply as Los Cuervos, the Ravens, who controlled something more dangerous than territory, information. Each gang had its own rules, its own economy, its own system of punishment and reward that operated completely independently of anything the administration put on paper, and every new inmate who arrived in Block C went through the same process. Assessment, not by guards, not by counselors, by the gangs. Watched from the moment the bus came through the gate, observed at intake, studied at the first meal, evaluated on the basis of signals so small that most people didn't know they were sending them. How you carried your tray, whether your hands were steady, whether your eyes moved too fast, or not at all. The calm man with the ponytail was assigned bunk 14. His cellmate, a wary, tattooed man named Ortega who had been inside long enough to read new arrivals like weather, looked him over from the top bunk. "You know where you are?" Ortega asked. The man set his mattress down, smoothed it once, he said. That was all. Ortega stared for a long moment, searching for the familiar signals, nerves, performance, calculation. He found nothing he recognized. He looked away. Something about this man's stillness was deeply unsettling. Not threatening, not passive, just completely, unmovably present. By dinner that first evening, all 3 gang leaders had received the same report. New inmate. Calm, didn't flinch during intake. Ate alone without asking permission. Moved through the facility like a man running a familiar errand. And all 3 arrived at the same conclusion. He needed to be broken. Tonight. What none of them understood, what none of them could have guessed looking at an older man, eating quietly in the corner of a prison cafeteria, was that they had just made the single most consequential mistake of their time inside Ridgecrest. What would you do if the most dangerous person in the room was also the quietest? The bus pulled into Ridgecrest Correctional Facility at 60:14 in the morning. Rain, gray sky. The kind of silence that only exists in places where hope checks out at the front gate and never comes back for its belongings. 14 new inmates stepped off that bus. Heads down, eyes empty. Moving the way people move when they have already made their peace with what is waiting on the other side of the intake door. Most of them had been through the system before. They knew the rules without being told. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak first. Don't show fear. But never show strength either, not yet. Not until you understand exactly who controls what. But one man on that bus didn't follow any of those rules. He didn't look down. He didn't look nervous. He stepped off slowly, the way a man steps off a boat he has sailed 1,000 times. Not because the water isn't dangerous, but because he made his peace with dangerous water a very long time ago. Medium height, older, a little heavier than photographs suggested, salt and pepper ponytail, slightly damp from the rain, no expression on his face, just eyes, still dark. Patient, the kind of eyes that have seen the worst this world offers, sat across from it, measured it, absorbed it, and quietly decided it wasn't that interesting. The correctional officers ran them through intake. Fingerprints, photos, jumpsuits. The new inmates were assigned to Block C general population. That was the first problem. Because Block C at Ridgecrest wasn't just another cell block. Every inmate processed through that facility knew the name before they ever saw the corridor. Guards who worked that block came in every morning with their shoulders already slightly tighter than they should have been. 3 gangs controlled everything inside those walls. The Westside Kings ran the yard and the work rotations. The Iron Brotherhood controlled the cafeteria and the supply lines, and a group known simply as Los Cuervos, the Ravens, who controlled something more dangerous than territory, information. Each gang had its own rules, its own economy, its own system of punishment and reward that operated completely independently of anything the administration put on paper, and every new inmate who arrived in Block C went through the same process, assessment, not by guards, not by counselors, by the gangs. Watched from the moment the bus came through the gate, observed at intake, studied at the first meal, evaluated on the basis of signals so small that most people didn't know they were sending them. How you carried your tray, whether your hands were steady, whether your eyes moved too fast, or not at all. The calm man with the ponytail was assigned bunk 14, his cellmate a wary, tattooed man named Ortega who had been inside long enough to read new arrivals like weather, looked him over from the top bunk. "You know where you are?" Ortega asked. The man set his mattress down. Smoothed it once. "I do," he said. That was all. Ortega stared for a long moment, searching for the familiar signals, nerves, performance, calculation. He found nothing he recognized. He looked away. Something about this man's stillness was deeply unsettling. Not threatening, not passive, just completely, unmovably present. By dinner that first evening, all 3 gang leaders had received the same report. New inmate. Older, calm, didn't flinch during intake, ate alone without asking permission, moved through the facility like a man running a familiar errand, and all 3 arrived at the same conclusion. He needed to be broken. Tonight. What none of them understood, what none of them could have guessed looking at an older man, eating quietly in the corner of a prison cafeteria, was that they had just made the single most consequential mistake of their time inside Ridgecrest. Lights out at Ridgecrest came at 10 p.m. The fluorescent strips clicked off block by block, like dominoes falling down a long corridor, until the whole facility settled into institutional dimness. Not full darkness, never full darkness, just a gray half-light that flattened everything and made distances hard to judge. For most inmates, that shift meant rest. For Los Cuervos, it meant the work was finally starting. At 23 p.m., 4 of their most experienced members moved through the east corridor toward Block C low. Quiet. The practiced efficiency of men who have done this enough times to stop thinking about the individual steps. They reached bunk 14. The door was slightly open. The first man stepped inside. He stopped immediately. The bunk was empty, not slept in and abandoned, never occupied at all. The mattress flat and smooth, and untouched exactly as it had been made that morning. Before anyone could process what this meant, a single flashlight clicked on. From the far end of the corridor, held low and steady, Seagal stood there, hands at his sides, weight balanced. The light positioned to illuminate the 4 men in the doorway without blinding them, which meant he could see their faces perfectly. "Looking for something," he said. What happened next lasted 45 seconds. Hold that number. Because the way it spread through Block C the following morning, passed from mouth to ear in the cafeteria, in the corners of the yard, in the quiet spaces where men speak in low voices about things that have shifted the atmosphere of a place they thought they understood. You would think it lasted much longer. You would think it was loud. It wasn't. No shouting. No weapons drawn. No sounds that traveled to the guard station. Just 4 men moving toward 1 man in a corridor. And 45 seconds later all 4 of them were on the floor. Not unconscious. Not seriously hurt. Simply placed there. Each one with a precision that was almost considerate. As deliberate and economical as a man moving furniture. Not 1 ounce of force beyond what was necessary. Not 1 movement that served anything other than a specific, exact purpose. Seagal walked to the guard station and knocked twice. For men down in the east corridor, they'll need a few minutes. The guard stared at him. What happened? They tripped, Seagal said, and walked back to his bunk. By morning it had reached every corner of the facility. traveling faster than official information always travels in closed institutions, arriving at each person already slightly reshaped by the mouth that carried it last. The version told by Los Curvos was edited in the ways these accounts are always edited, but the result was undeniable and uneditable. 4 men went in. 4 men came back with nothing to show for it. The target was fine. Entirely, completely, unremarkably fine. Trent heard the report and made his decision immediately. If 4 men weren't enough, the answer was 10, public. Midday. In the yard where every inmate in Block C would be watching. Not just a message to the target, but a demonstration to every pair of eyes in the facility. This is what happens. This is who we are. This does not change. At 2 p.m. Seagal was on his bench, reading. Trent came across the yard with 10 men fanned out behind him. The formation closing off exits without looking deliberate. The yard going quiet in the way yards go quiet when something is about to happen. Ambient noise pulling back, conversations tapering, bodies turning by small degrees toward the source of tension. Trent stood over him. "You think last night means something?" he said. Seagal looked up, took his time. Actually looked, the way a doctor reads a patient's chart before speaking. Reading the specific vocabulary of the man's body, the history written in the way he stood. "You were a boxer?" Seagal said. Trent blinked. "Golden Gloves. 2003, 7 and 2. Complete silence from Trent, something shifting behind his expression. "You led with your left in those days." "You still do. I can tell by how you're standing right now." The 10 men behind Trent exchanged glances. This was not the script they had arrived with. "That's not going to help you," Trent said. Seagal closed his book. "I'm not here to fight you," he said. "I'm not here to fight anyone." A pause. "Walk away. Not because I'm threatening you, because you're smarter than this situation. And somewhere inside you, you already know that." 10 full seconds of silence. The kind of 10 seconds that contain more movement than most conversations. Then Trent turned. His men followed without a word. The yard stayed quiet. Not the temporary quiet of a fight postponed. The permanent quiet of something having genuinely shifted. But that evening, in 3 separate corners of Block C, the same conversation was happening. Darnell, Trent, Los Curvos, all 3 reaching the same new conclusion. Not more men. Not more force. Something different. Something that would require using the one weapon that physical confrontation had failed to deliver. Information. Specifically, the information Darnell had been sitting on since that morning. The information that, if used correctly, changed everything about how this situation needed to be handled. And not necessarily in the direction any of them had originally planned. What would you do if you realized the person you had been targeting was never the prey at all? That evening, Darnell called a meeting. Not the usual kind, not the loose gathering in the yard that looked like nothing to the guards on the walkway above. This was the 3 of them. Darnell, Trent, the Los Curvos leader, a man named Rise who rarely spoke in groups because the things he said in private were usually enough. They met in the far corner of the workshop during evening rotation. 3 men who had not shared the same space voluntarily in 2 years. 3 men whose territories operated on the understanding that coordination only happened when the alternative was worse. Darnell put the paper on the table. He didn't say anything. Just let them read it. Trent read it once. Then again. Reyes read it once and set it down and looked at the wall for a long moment. "This is the man we sent 4 people at last night," Reyes said finally. "Not a question. Yes," Darnell said. Another silence. The paper was a partial file. Fragments pulled from sources Darnell's network had spent the previous 36 hours compiling. Not the full picture, but enough. Steven Seagal, Aikido master, 7th Dan black belt. Trained under Kishimaru Yeshiba, the son of the man who created the art. The first foreigner in history to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan. Not a student who had learned from books or weekend seminars. A man who had lived inside the discipline for decades until the discipline, and the man became the same thing. Films. Dozens of them. But that wasn't the part that had made Darnell go still. Before the films, before the fame. Work that was never publicly documented. Associations with law enforcement agencies that operated in the space between what is acknowledged and what is not. A record of involvement in situations overseas, domestic, in categories that didn't have clean names. That pointed to a man whose real capabilities had always existed several floors below what was visible on the surface. And then the detail that none of them could set aside. He had walked into Ridgecrest voluntarily, not caught, not sentenced, not transferred from another facility. He had come in through the front door, under an arrangement that the partial file gestured at without fully explaining. An arrangement that involved people outside these walls who had access to channels that none of the three men in that workshop had ever been able to reach. He chose to be here, Trent said. Slowly, Darnell said. Trent leaned back. His boxer's instinct, the part of him that had spent years reading opponents across the ring, that had developed a physical vocabulary for recognizing when a man was operating at his limit and when he was nowhere near it, was suddenly very loud. The yard, Trent said quietly. Darnell looked at him. Yesterday, when I walked up to him with 10 men, Trent paused. He closed his book. He looked at me, and he stopped. Calm, Ray said. Not performed calm, Trent said. Not the kind a man does when he's frightened and covering it. The real kind. He shook his head slightly. The kind that comes from knowing the outcome before the situation starts. The three of them sat with that. Outside the workshop window, the facility moved through its evening rhythms: count, rotation, the mechanical indifference of institutional time. So what do we do? Reyes asked. It was the right question, and it had, in the architecture of the situation they now understood themselves to be inside, a very limited number of real answers. They could continue, escalate past what had already failed twice, commit more resources to a confrontation with a man who had walked into their facility, knowing exactly what was here, and had been unbothered by it from the moment he arrived. Or they could ask the question that none of them had asked yet, the question that should have been the first question. Not how do we break him, but why is he here? Because a man with his background, his capabilities, his specific history of operating in places and situations that didn't make it into official records, did not end up in Block C of Ridgecrest Correctional Facility by accident. He came here to find something, and in 3 days, moving quietly through their facility with his book and his bench and his unhurried meals, he had been looking. The question was, had he found it yet? What would you do if you realized the person you had been targeting was never the prey at all? The answer was yes, he had found it. On the second night before Los Curvos came to the East Corridor, Seagal had done something none of the three gang leaders had thought to account for in their planning. He had sat down next to the one man in Block C who had been invisible to all of them, not because he was weak, not because he lacked affiliation or protection, but because invisibility had been the entire point. His name was Marcus Webb, 44 years old, quiet, unremarkable in every surface measurement: his sentence, his conduct record, his daily movements through the facility. A man who had been inside Ridgecrest for 16 months and had made himself into furniture. Present everywhere, noticed nowhere. Webb was the reason Seagal had walked through the gate, not Darnell, not Trent, not Reyes, not the gangs whose confrontations had consumed the first 3 days, and whose names would fill the story everyone told afterward. Webb, because Marcus Webb had, for 16 months, been passing information out of Ridgecrest to an organization that used it to locate and threaten protected federal witnesses connected to a prosecution involving a trafficking network operating across 6 American cities. Not drugs moving through the facility, not weapons, not any of the physical contraband that gang intelligence networks were designed to detect and respond to, just information, clean, weightless, moving in pieces small enough to pass through every layer of detection without triggering anything: names, locations, the precise details that turned safe houses into known addresses. 3 witnesses had already been found, frightened into silence or forced into emergency relocation. The prosecution, built over 4 years, was collapsing quietly from the inside, and the FBI's conventional investigative approach had failed to identify the source because Webb operated completely outside the gang structure that their informants were positioned to monitor. Outside the visible power structure, passing intelligence through a channel that standard methods couldn't access. What he had been sent to do was identify the source. What he had not been told, because the people who sent him didn't know, was what Webb would do when someone simply sat beside him at dinner on the second evening and said, without pressure, without performance, "You look like a man who's been carrying something heavy for a long time." Webb had looked at him, and something in him had simply shifted. He talked for nearly 2 hours. Eyes moving periodically to the perimeter, voice barely above a whisper. telling Seagal not just who he was and what he had been doing, but how the specific mechanics of how the information moved, who received it, who used it, and how far up the chain the operation actually reached. And then he told him something else. Something that sat differently from everything else he had said. The first witness whose location had been passed, a man who had agreed to testify at considerable personal risk, had been found at his relocation address. He had a daughter, 8 years old. She had been with him when they came. They hadn't touched her, but they had been there, in the place that was supposed to be safe, standing in the doorway of the room where she slept, making sure the witness understood, without any ambiguity, that the distance between a warning and something worse was entirely at their discretion. Webb had known there was a child. He had passed the information anyway, not because he didn't care. He had spent 16 months not sleeping properly, not eating properly, not existing in any of the ordinary ways a person exists when they are at peace with their own choices. He had passed it because the people he worked for had shown him, once, what happened to people who changed their minds. A man he had known, a man he had worked alongside, who had decided midway through that he wanted to stop. Webb had seen what stopping looked like, so he had continued, and told himself what people tell themselves when the alternative is unbearable, that it was the only available choice. Now Seagal sat in the small conference room near the intake office and laid all of it out for Harlan, the man in gray who had been managing this operation from the outside and had failed for 16 months to get past the gang structure to the man actually responsible. Harlan listened without interrupting. When Seagal finished, the room was quiet for a long time. He told you all of this voluntarily, Harlan said.
Yes. Why?
Seagal looked at the frosted window. Beyond it, somewhere in the facility, Webb was in his bunk, not sleeping. Because he has been waiting for someone to give him a way out, Seagal said. Not an excuse, not an escape. A path that means something. He paused. People who carry things they can't put down, they don't need to be broken. They need to believe that putting it down is still possible. Harlan was quiet. And the gangs, he said. Darnell, Reyes, they were never the target, Seagal said. They were the environment. They came at you 3 times. Yes, and Seagal considered this. They were doing what the environment trained them to do, he said. That's different from who they are. Harlan looked at him carefully. You believe that? I've spent a long time learning the difference between what a situation turns a person into and what they actually are underneath it. A silence. Webb will cooperate fully, Seagal said. Full testimony. Everything he knows. In exchange for something real on the other side. You're certain? He already decided, Seagal said. The night he sat down beside me, he just needed someone to believe it was possible. And in that small room, with that one sentence, the entire shape of a 16-month operation changed direction. Is it ever possible to separate what a person has done from what pushed them to do it? What happened next happened on 2 levels simultaneously. One was not. On the invisible level, Harlan made calls. Careful calls to careful people. Within 48 hours, a federal prosecutor had been quietly briefed. A counter-intelligence team assembled from personnel with no overlap with the original compromised investigation. The partial description Webb had provided, physical details, behavioral patterns, a specific phrase remembered from a phone call he was never supposed to be on, was enough. Deputy Marshal Creighton Farrell, 14 years of service. A record that read like a commendation. A man whose colleagues would spend years cycling back through their memories looking for the moment they should have seen it. He was placed under surveillance within hours of being identified and arrested 6 days after Seagal first sat in that conference room. 3 additional arrests followed in 2 different cities. The outer links of the chain that had been using Webb as its interior relay point beginning to come apart simultaneously. The witnesses who had gone silent began to cooperate again. The prosecution that had been quietly dying began to breathe. None of it was public. None of it made news. The people involved preferred the silence for reasons that were practical, institutional, and in several cases deeply personal. But on the other level, the visible one, inside the walls of Block C, something entirely different was unfolding, because Darnell Trent and Rise had spent the previous 2 days working through the same question from different directions. Why is he here? And they had reached the same answer that Seagal had never hidden from anyone willing to look. Not because he had told them. He had told no one. but because men who are very good at reading environments, and all three of them, whatever else they were very good at reading environments, had watched him for 5 days, had watched him move, had watched him observe, had watched the specific quality of his attention land on different people, in different situations, and had begun, slowly, to see the pattern. He wasn't watching the gangs. He was watching around them. Darnell was the one who understood it first. Sitting in the workshop on the 5th evening, running back through every interaction, every position Seagal had chosen to occupy in the cafeteria and the yard, always with a sight line to Webb, never to any of them. The confrontations, the 4 men in the corridor, the 10 men in the yard, had not disrupted him, because they were never the thing he was actually focused on. He had handled them the way a man handles interruptions when he is in the middle of something important. Efficiently. Completely. Then returned his attention to what mattered. Darnell found Seagal in the yard on the 6th morning, alone, no formation behind him, no preparation visible in his posture. He sat down beside him the way Trent would sit down beside him 2 days later, with the simple directness of a man who has run out of reasons to approach things indirectly. "Webb," Darnell said. Seagal looked at him. "That's who you're here for." A pause. "Yes," Seagal said. Darnell was quiet for a long moment, processing the specific quality of being outmaneuvered, not through force or superior resources, but through patience and the ability to see a room more completely than everyone else in it. "You let us come at you," Darnell said. 3 times. "I needed to understand the environment," Seagal said. "You could have been hurt." Seagal looked out across the yard. "No," he said simply, and it wasn't arrogance, it wasn't performance. It was a plain statement of fact delivered by a man who had spent decades developing an accurate understanding of his own capabilities, and had learned to neither inflate nor diminish them. Darnell sat with that. The witnesses' web was selling out. Seagal said after a moment, "People with families, people who did the hardest thing, agreed to stand up and say what they knew in front of people who wanted them silent." He paused. "One of them had a daughter. 8 years old. She was there when they came to the address." Darnell was very still. Webb didn't know who he was really working for. Seagal continued. "Not completely. He knew enough to be afraid. Not enough to understand the full shape of it." A long silence. "What happens to him?" Darnell asked. "That depends on what he does next," Seagal said. "There's a path. It's not comfortable. But it's real." Darnell looked at the ground. At the concrete he had walked across 10,000 times. At the yard he had controlled through force and intelligence, and the accumulated weight of years. "You came in here," Darnell said slowly, "with knock-up, no weapon, no authority. Less. And you did all of this." Seagal was quiet for a moment. "I came in here with the same thing I always carry," he said. Darnell looked at him. "Patience," Seagal said, "and the willingness to see what's actually in front of me, instead of what I expect to find." 2 days later, Trent sat beside him on the same bench. No formation, no agenda, just a man who had spent years misdirecting the best part of himself, and had, in the past week, begun to understand what that cost. He extended his hand. Seagal took it. Brief, firm, no audience required. "Do you think real strength is about what you can do, or about what you choose not to do?" On day 12, Seagal walked out of Ridgecrest the same way he had walked in, quietly. The gate opened. He walked through. A plane car waited at the edge of the lot. He got in. The gate closed behind him, and the facility absorbed the event the way it absorbed everything, smoothly, completely, without visible trace. The sky was pale and still. Nothing like the rain of the morning he arrived. Just a flat winter light that made everything look slightly more honest than usual. He didn't look back inside. The rhythms resumed. Count. Rotation. The mechanical indifference of institutional time moving forward, because it always moves forward regardless of what has happened inside it. But something had been left behind. Not a rule. Not a program. Not any of the official interventions that get written into policy and measured in quarterly reports. Something that doesn't have an easy name. Something that lives below the level of what institutions can manufacture or measure. The kind of thing that arrives not through force or instruction, but through the specific experience of watching one person, in the middle of an environment designed to reduce everything to its worst version, refuse to be reduced. Carver noticed it first. The week after Seagal left, men moved through the cafeteria slightly differently. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would generate a note in any file. Just a quality of small human transactions, The way a tray was passed, the way a seat was offered, the way an argument escalated before it found its usual shape, that had shifted by some nearly immeasurable degree. The younger inmates who had watched everything from careful distances, the ones who had arrived at Ridgecrest still in the process of deciding what kind of person they were going to be inside these walls. Something had reached them. Not a speech, not a lesson, just the evidence of a man living exactly as he believed, completely and without compromise, in the middle of a place that offered every reason not to. Carver sat in his cell that evening and wrote a letter, to no one in particular, just words placed on paper, because some things become too heavy to carry only inside your own mind. I've seen every kind of man come through here, he wrote. Hard men, broken men, men who arrived burning and left hollow. But I never saw a man walk in with nothing to prove and still change the temperature of the whole room. He didn't lecture anyone. He didn't perform anything. He just treated every person he met, every dangerous, damaged, difficult person, as if they were still worth taking seriously. That made me think about every time I decided. I already knew someone before they opened their mouth. Every surface I looked at and decided I understood what was underneath. We do this everywhere. Not just in here. Out there too. In all the ordinary places where people pass each other without actually seeing each other. And sometimes the person we've already dismissed, the one we looked at once and filed away, is the one who could have changed something. If we had stayed still long enough to find out, 3 gangs had come for one man in the first 72 hours. They came with numbers, with history, with the full weight of everything they had built over years inside those walls. And what they had encountered was not a man trying to survive them. It was a man who had already decided, long before the bus pulled through the gate, long before the rain and the gray sky, and the receptionist who didn't look up, exactly who he was, and who had made the quiet, unshakable decision to remain that person regardless of what the environment produced. That is the thing that can't be taken, not by a place, not by the people who run it, not by anyone who looks at your age, your appearance, your circumstances, and decides in 2 seconds that they already know your story. Your real power is not what you can do to a room. It is who you remain when the room is doing everything it can to make you someone else. Thank you for watching this far, genuinely. Your time is the one thing we never take for granted. More stories are coming. Stories about people who walked into impossible situations carrying nothing but who they were, and changed everything around them without ever raising their voice. Stories about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. Before you go, we want to know, which part stayed with you the longest? The 45 seconds in the corridor? Darnell sitting down without a formation? Carver's letter at the end? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your answers directly shape what we build next. If this reminded you that calm is the most powerful thing in any room, leave a like. If someone in your life needs to hear this today, send it to them. More good stories are on the way. See you soon.